The night my son slid a stack of papers across the kitchen table and told me to sign, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I picked up those papers, said goodnight like I was headed to bed after a long shift, and walked down the hall to my room. My hands were steady. My heart was not. Welcome, dear friends, to the Voices of Tears channel. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Pull up a chair and stay a while, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that starts with a mother's love and ends with a mother's courage. It happened right here in a little suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, on a street called Maplewood Drive. And every word of it is true. My name is Barbara Jean Collins. I'm 62 years old, and I spent 31 years working as a registered nurse at Riverside Hospital early mornings, double shifts, holidays away from my family. I'm not telling you that to earn sympathy. I'm telling you because every dollar that went into the house on Maplewood Drive came from tired hands and long nights, mine and Frank's both. Frank Collins was a mechanic, broad-shouldered, quiet man who could fix anything with an engine and grew the most beautiful roses you ever saw in a backyard garden. We bought that house 33 years ago when Ethan was barely out of diapers, a 3-bedroom colonial with a cracked front walk and a furnace that rattled like a sick dog every February. We didn't care. It was ours, Frank used to say, standing on the back porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the yard he'd spent the weekend taming. Nobody's ever going to put us out again, Barbara. Nobody. He'd grown up in rental houses where a landlord's mood could flip your whole world upside down. That house on Maplewood Drive was his answer to every one of those landlords. It was his declaration. We had 2 boys. Ethan came firstborn when Frank and I were still figuring out how to be adults ourselves. Those early years were lean. I was working nights and Frank was picking up side jobs on weekends, and Ethan grew up in a house where the lights stayed on but the margin was thin. He was a quiet kid who learned early that his parents were busy. And he adapted to that the way children do by becoming self-sufficient in some ways and, I see now, quietly resentful in others. Not a mean child, just one who learned to look out for himself first. Daniel came along 7 years later, when the worst of the struggle was behind us. Frank had steady work by then. We had a little breathing room. Frank taught Daniel to prune the rose bushes, repaint the back fence, replace a door hinge without stripping the screw. Those 2 spent whole Saturday mornings just puttering around that yard together. I used to watch them from the kitchen window and feel like the richest woman in Ohio, Ethan noticed. He never said anything outright, but I could see it, the slight tightening around his eyes when Frank ruffled Daniel's hair. I think he told himself Daniel was the favorite, the one who got the easier version of the parents. Maybe there was some truth to it. Life had softened us by the time Daniel came along. What Ethan never understood was that the version of Frank who taught a 10-year-old boy to paint a fence, that man had been built by the same hard years Ethan grew up in. Frank had earned the right to be gentler. We both had. The 2 brothers were never enemies, but they were never close the way I'd hoped. There was a distance between them, not hostile, just permanent, like 2 rooms in the same house that never quite connected. I filed that away in the back of my mind for years, the way mothers do with things they pray will eventually sort themselves out. 8 years ago, Frank was cutting the grass on a warm Saturday in June. I was inside pulling a casserole from the oven. I heard the mower stop and thought nothing of it, figured he'd stopped for water. When I looked out the window and saw him down in the grass, I dropped the casserole on the floor and ran. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. Massive heart attack. No warning. No goodbye. I won't spend long on that part. Some grief is too large to fit into a story. I'll just say that the house felt entirely different after Frank left it, like the air had changed composition. I kept the roses going because they were his, and because standing out there in the morning with the pruning shears made me feel like he hadn't gone so very far. That was my grief, and it was mine to carry. For 2 years, I carried it alone. I worked my shifts. I came home. I had supper with Denise Pruitt next door, my neighbor of 20 years, one of the truest friends God ever put on this earth, and I managed. I was lonely, but I was steady. Then Ethan called. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and I could hear it in his voice before he said a word, that particular flatness that means a person is trying to hold themselves together over the phone. He'd lost his job in Cleveland. Something with the company restructuring, he said. which I understood to mean it wasn't entirely his fault but wasn't entirely not his fault either. His savings were nearly gone. He was embarrassed, and underneath the embarrassment, he was scared. I didn't hesitate. Not for 1 second. "Come home," I told him. "Your room is here." He was on Maplewood Drive within the week. I gave him the guest room, the larger one, with the window that looked out over Frank's rose bushes, and I was glad to have the house feel occupied again. For a few weeks, it was just the two of us, and it was almost comfortable. We had coffee in the mornings. He helped me with a few things around the house that I'd been putting off. I started to think maybe this was one of those unexpected gifts that comes wrapped in hard times. Then he brought Madison home for dinner. She was attractive in that sharp, deliberate way, the kind of woman who chooses every word the same way she chooses an outfit. She complimented my pot roast. She asked thoughtful questions about my nursing career. She laughed at the right moments and listened with her whole face. I remember thinking, well, Ethan finally found someone with a little polish. 6 months later, they were married at City Hall. Small ceremony, just a few of Ethan's friends and a couple of Madison's co-workers. I wore a blue dress and smiled in every photograph. I gave Madison a pearl bracelet that had been my mother's. I meant it as a welcome. Daniel wasn't there. He was finishing his doctoral research in engineering up at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, about 3 hours north, and the date conflicted with his dissertation schedule. He sent a card and called Ethan that night. He called me too, to check in, the way he always did. My quiet one, my steady one. Denise came to the little reception we held at the house afterward. She shook Madison's hand and was perfectly gracious. But later, standing in my kitchen while Madison held court in the living room, Denise leaned close and said, just low enough that only I could hear, "She's working hard to make an impression, Barbara." I'd watch that. I told her she was being uncharitable. I wish I had listened. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing I want you to understand. If Madison had walked into my house on day 1 and started moving walls, I would have recognized it immediately for what it was. But she was smarter than that. She worked the way water works on stone, slowly, consistently, so gradually that by the time you notice the damage, the shape of everything has already changed. The first thing was the sofa. It was a big, overstuffed sectional in a warm caramel color. Frank and I had saved up for us the year Daniel started middle school, and I had loved that sofa with an embarrassing loyalty ever since. It wasn't fashionable. It was deep and soft, and it held the shape of everyone who had ever sat in it. And on winter evenings, I would curl up on the left corner with a blanket and a book and feel, in some small but real way, like Frank was still in the house with me. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs and it was gone. In its place sat a gray sectional sleeker, lower to the ground, the kind of couch that looks expensive in a magazine and uncomfortable in a living room. I stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds before I found my voice. "Madison, where's my sofa?" She looked up from her laptop with an expression of pleasant surprise, as though I'd asked something charmingly naive. "Oh, I had it moved to the basement. It was taking up so much visual space, Barbara. This one opens the room up so much more, don't you think?" I looked at Ethan. He was pouring coffee at the kitchen counter and did not look up. "That was my sofa," I said. "I'd like it brought back." "Of course," she said, smiling. "We can talk about it." We never talked about it. The photographs came down 3 weeks later. I had a wall in the hallway, what I always called the family wall, covered in 30 years of photographs in mismatched frames. Frank in his mechanic's uniform the year we bought the house, Ethan at his high school graduation, Daniel at about 8 years old, gap-toothed, holding a garden trowel next to Frank and looking enormously proud of himself. Our first Christmas on Maplewood Drive, when the boys were young and Frank had strung so many lights on the eaves that the neighbors came outside to look. I came home from a Thursday shift to find the wall bare. The photographs were in a cardboard box at the top of the basement stairs, face down, stacked without tissue paper between them. I sat down on the bottom stair and looked at that box for a long time. When I brought it up to Ethan that evening, he had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Madison thought the hallway needed to be freshened up," he said. "She's been working on the whole aesthetic of the main floor." "Ethan," I kept my voice level, "those are our family photographs. Your father is in those frames." "I know, Mom." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'll talk to her." Whatever that conversation was, it changed nothing. The wall stayed bare, the box stayed in the basement, and I began, for the first time, to feel like a guest in my own house, not thrown out, not mistreated in any way I could point to cleanly, but subtly, persistently diminished. Like someone was slowly adjusting the volume on my presence in that house until I could barely hear myself. Then came the kitchen. I have cooked in that kitchen for 33 years. I know where everything lives, the way I know my own hands, the good knives in the second drawer left, the mixing bowls stacked by size on the third shelf, the spare can opener hung on the inside of the cabinet door where I've always kept it. It is a small thing, a kitchen. But when you are a woman living alone, the kitchen is often the only room in the house that is entirely, unambiguously yours. I came downstairs one morning to make breakfast and couldn't find my cast iron skillet. Then I couldn't find the measuring cups. Then I opened 3 wrong cabinets looking for my coffee mugs. Everything had been moved, reorganized into what Madison apparently considered a more logical system, without a word to me, overnight, while I was sleeping. I stood in the middle of my kitchen feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than anger. Something that felt like erasure. When I told Denise, she didn't say a word. She just looked at me with those steady brown eyes of hers and set down her coffee cup and said, "Barbara Jean, what exactly are you going to do about this?" I didn't have a good answer for her. Not yet. The door lock was the moment the cold feeling became something I couldn't explain away. I noticed it on a Wednesday morning. I'd slept in after a long shift and came out to the hallway still half awake, and something caught my eye. A small chrome fixture on the outside of my bedroom door. A lock. Not a privacy latch installed from the inside, the way you'd do if someone wanted their own space. A keyed lock, installed on the outside. I stood there in my bathrobe and stared at it. From the outside. Meaning it could not be operated from within the room. Meaning someone standing in that hallway could, if they chose, lock that door while I was inside it. I went downstairs and found Madison at the kitchen table with her planner open. I asked her very calmly when that lock had been installed and who had authorized it. She didn't even look up from her planner. It's just a security measure. We've had some neighborhood break-ins. On the inside of my bedroom door. The outside, Barbara. It's on the hallway side, standard installation. I know which side it's on, I said. That's why I'm asking. She looked up then, and her expression was patient in a way that made me feel about 90 years old. If it bothers you, we can look into a different solution. I went back upstairs and I sat on the edge of my bed and I breathed. Slow and steady, the way I'd learned to breathe in 30 years of nursing, when something was happening in that room, and you could not afford to fall apart. And I thought about Frank, about what he would have said, standing there in that hallway, looking at a lock on the outside of his wife's bedroom door. He would have taken it off with a screwdriver in about 45 seconds. That wasn't the option available to me. But I filed it. I filed every single thing I had observed in the past several weeks, and I began to organize it in my mind, the way I organized patient charts systematically, without emotion, looking for the pattern that explained the whole picture. The pattern revealed itself not long after. Madison had begun making small comments, casual, almost offhand, the kind of remark you could easily dismiss as innocent if you weren't paying attention. She mentioned a figure a neighbor had gotten for their house. Imagine what this place could bring in the current market. She talked about a real estate investor she knew. People are doing very creative things with property these days. Once, at dinner, she said with a light little laugh that a house this size, managed properly, could generate real income. Each comment stood alone, harmless. Together, they formed a sentence I was just beginning to read. I watched Ethan during these moments. He never contributed to the remarks, but he never redirected them either. He'd reach for the bread or refill his glass, performing the particular kind of focused neutrality that means a person has heard those words before and made their peace with them. My son, who had grown up in this house, who had eaten 1,000 dinners at this table, who had watched his father plant roses in that backyard, was sitting right beside me while someone mapped out the future of what we had built. And he was not objecting. I want to be fair. I don't know, even now, exactly when Ethan crossed whatever line he crossed. I don't know if it happened all at once or the same way the other changes had happened gradually, like water on stone. What I know is what I saw. And what I saw was a man who had learned, somewhere in his marriage, to follow rather than lead. Denise asked me one afternoon if I had called Daniel lately. "He's busy," I said. "Dissertation." "He's your son," she said. "He's never too busy." I told her I didn't want to worry him over things that might come to nothing. She gave me a look that said she thought I was wrong about that. She was right, of course. She usually was. I have worked night shifts in a hospital for the better part of 3 decades. I have learned to move through a dark house without turning on lights, to navigate by memory and instinct, to be present without announcing myself. It is a skill you develop when you spend years trying not to wake a sleeping husband or 2 small boys after a 12-hour shift. I never imagined that skill would one day be the thing that saved my home. It was a Tuesday night in late November, about 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. I had gone to bed early, I'd been fighting a sinus headache all day, and wanted nothing more than 8 hours and silence. I fell asleep by 9, which is unusual for me. What woke me at 11:30? I couldn't tell you. A sound, maybe, or just that particular alertness that sometimes pulls a light sleeper up from the deep without any clear reason. I lay still for a moment, listening. The house was quiet except for the low murmur of voices from downstairs, Ethan and Madison in the kitchen. Not arguing, nothing that urgent. Just talking, in the steady, deliberate way of 2 people working through a plan. I told myself it was nothing. I almost rolled over and closed my eyes. Instead, I got up. I moved down the hallway in socked feet, staying close to the wall where the floorboards don't creak. The kitchen light was on, throwing a pale rectangle out into the dark living room. I stopped just outside that rectangle, back against the wall, and I listened. Madison's voice first, measured and clear. She was talking about the house. Not in the vague, hinting way she'd been using at dinner for weeks. This was specific. She used the phrase, current assessed value. She talked about equity, how much had built up over 30 years, what it represented. She talked about timing. The market won't hold like this forever, she said. If we're going to move on this, it needs to be soon. I heard Ethan make a sound, not words, just the low murmur of a man following along. Then Madison said something that stopped my breath. She said, "Once the title transfers, everything changes. The refinancing becomes straightforward, and the whole situation resolves itself." I pressed my back harder against the wall. Ethan said quietly, "You really think she'll sign?" There was a brief pause. Then Madison, with a certainty that turned my blood cold, "She trusts you, and she doesn't understand what she's signing. That's all we need." I stood in that dark hallway for what felt like a very long time. I was aware of my own breathing. I was aware of the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock above the stove, the same clock that had hung there since Frank put it up in 1994. I was aware of my heart, which was doing something complicated and painful in my chest. Then Ethan said, almost too quietly to catch, "I know it's her house, but it's going to be ours eventually anyway. We're just moving the timeline." I went back upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, and I thought about Frank. Not with sentimentality, not that night. I thought about Frank the way you think about a person whose judgment you trusted completely, trying to borrow some of that judgment when your own feels insufficient. "What would you do right now?" I asked him. "What do I do with this?" What came back to me wasn't words. It was an image Frank at the kitchen table, going through paperwork with his reading glasses on, moving slowly and carefully because he never trusted anything he hadn't read twice. "Read everything," he used to say. "Read it and read it again before you put your name on it." The papers appeared the following night. I had spent the day functioning, normally made coffee, did laundry, went to the pharmacy. I told no one what I had heard. I needed to see the document before I said a word, because I had learned long ago that accusations without evidence are just noise, and I was not going to make noise. I was going to be precise. It was 11:45 when I came downstairs for a glass of water and found them at the kitchen table. Ethan and Madison, side by side, a stack of papers between them, and a pen laid on top like it was already decided. They looked up when I walked in, and something passed across Madison's face, not guilt, exactly. More like the focused expression of someone who has been waiting for an opportunity and just watched it walk through the door on its own. She smiled. "Barbara, actually, good timing. We have some paperwork we need to go over with you." I looked at the stack of papers. I looked at my son. Ethan met my eyes for exactly 1 second, then looked at the table. "What kind of paperwork?" I said. Madison slid the stack toward me with one hand, easy as passing the salt. "Just some refinancing documents. It's standard procedure since you're on the title. You need to sign off. It's really just a formality. It won't take 5 minutes." I sat down. I picked up the papers. I am a woman who spent 31 years reading medical charts, medication orders, and insurance documents in fluorescent light at 2 in the morning. I read carefully. I read thoroughly, and I do not sign things I haven't read. I went through the first page slowly, then the second. The language was dense and full of the kind of technical phrasing designed to make a person feel that close reading is unnecessary, that this is simply what legal documents look like, and of course it's fine. But on the third page, nested inside a paragraph about property conveyance, I found what I was looking for. Transfer of ownership interest, not refinancing language, not a formality. 4 words that meant the complete and permanent surrender of my legal rights to my own house. I set the papers down on the table. "This isn't a refinancing document," I said. Madison didn't miss a beat. "It's part of the refinancing package. It's completely standard." "Madison." I kept my voice level. "I've been reading legal documents since before you were born. This is a transfer of ownership. If I sign this, I give up all rights to this property." A beat of silence. Ethan was looking at the table so hard I thought he might burn a hole through it. "You're misreading it," Madison said, her voice staying smooth. "It's just the way the legal language is structured." The attorney explained it to us. "Which attorney?" Another pause, shorter this time, but I caught it. "I'd like to take these to my room and review them," I said. And I picked up the papers before either of them could respond, and I walked down the hall, and I closed my door. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my small desk with the papers spread out under my bedside lamp, and I read every page 3 times. I underlined. I cross-referenced. By 2 in the morning, I understood exactly what was in front of me. And the picture it formed was one of the ugliest things I had ever seen, not because of what it said about Madison, who had never pretended to be anything other than what she was, if I had been paying close enough attention, but because of what it said about Ethan. My son had sat at that table, in the house where he grew up, and waited for his mother to walk in so his wife could hand her the pen. I thought about Frank. I thought about the night we signed the mortgage on this house, how Frank had read every page with his glasses on and his coffee going cold, how he'd asked the loan officer 2 questions that nobody else in the room had thought to ask, how proud I had been of him, how safe I had felt. "Nobody's ever going to put us out again, Barbara." I folded the papers carefully and put them in the inside pocket of my winter coat, hanging in the closet. Then I lay down on top of my covers, still dressed, and stared at the ceiling until the light outside my window went gray. I had one thing I needed to do in the morning, one person I needed to see. I needed someone who understood these documents not with a nurse's eye but with a lawyer's, and I needed to get there before anyone in this house realized I had not simply taken those papers to bed and given up. I had not given up. I had never been further from giving up in my life. I was out of the house by 7:15 the next morning. Ethan's truck was still in the driveway. He didn't leave for work until 8, so I moved quietly. I took my purse, my winter coat, with the papers still folded in the inside pocket, and my car keys. I did not make coffee. I did not leave a note. I backed out of that driveway in the gray November morning, like a woman who had simply decided to get an early start on her errands, which, in the most technical sense, was exactly what I was doing. I had called Rachel Mewen the night before from my cell phone, with the volume turned low, sitting on the edge of my tub with the bathroom door locked. Rachel was a real estate attorney I'd been referred to years back when Frank and I had updated our will. We hadn't needed her since, but I had kept her card in the small box in my closet where I kept the things that mattered. Her office opened at 8. I was in the parking lot at 7:55. Rachel Mewen was a small woman in her mid-50s with sharp eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who had heard a great many things that initially seemed shocking and had long since decided that nothing should be handled with panic. She shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and said, "Let's see what you've got." I laid the papers out in front of her. She read without speaking, turning pages with the methodical patience of a person who was paid to find exactly what was hiding in plain sight. I watched her face. It was professionally still until about the third page, when something behind her eyes shifted just slightly. But I had spent 30 years reading faces for signs people were trying to hide, and I saw it. She finished the last page, set it down, folded her hands. "Mrs. Collins," she said, "this is a quitclaim deed." I thought so. "Do you know what that means in practical terms?" "Tell me in legal terms," I said. "I want to hear it clearly." She nodded. A quitclaim deed transfers your entire ownership interest in the property to the named recipients, in this case, Ethan James Collins and Madison Lee Collins, immediately upon your signature and filing. No compensation to you, no conditions, no reversals. The moment this is signed and recorded, you have zero legal standing in that property. You could be asked to leave your own home and have no recourse. I sat with that for a moment. Outside Rachel's window, a delivery truck was backing into a loading dock across the street, beeping steadily. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary morning. "And the refinancing language?" I asked. "Is there any legitimate interpretation that connects this to a refinancing?" "None," Rachel said flatly. "This document has nothing to do with refinancing. It is a straight transfer of title. Whoever told you otherwise was either deeply mistaken about what they were presenting you or was not mistaken at all." I looked at my hands in my lap. "What's my current legal standing with the property?" Rachel turned to her computer, typed for a moment, and pulled up the county records. She turned the screen toward me. The deed on file for the house on Maplewood Drive showed one owner, recorded 33 years ago and never altered: Barbara Jean Collins. Not Frank and Barbara Collins, as it had originally read. Frank's name had been removed from the title through proper probate proceedings after his death, leaving me as the sole owner of record. I had handled that paperwork myself 8 years ago, in the fog of the first months of widowhood, and had not thought about it since. "Mrs. Collins," Rachel said, "your son and daughter-in-law are living in that house at your pleasure. They have no ownership interest whatsoever. They have no legal claim to the property. They are, in the eyes of the law, guests." I heard the word guests, and something in me went very quiet and very clear. The way things go quiet and clear in an emergency when you finally understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. "If I wanted them to leave," I said slowly, "what would that process look like?" Rachel walked me through it. Notice, requirements, timelines, options. She was thorough and matter-of-fact, and I listened to every word. Before I left, she made me a certified copy of the recorded deed and put it in a manila envelope with her business card. She told me to keep it somewhere safe and separate from my purse. She also told me, and this I appreciated more than I could express, that I should not let anyone in that house know I had been to see her until I was ready to use what I knew. "Timing matters," she said. "You're in the stronger position. Don't spend that advantage before you're ready." I drove back to Maplewood Drive with the manila envelope on the passenger seat and 33 years of mortgage payments and memories riding somewhere in my chest. I thought about the woman who had walked out of that house at 7:15 that morning, quiet, careful, moving through her own life like she was trying not to take up too much space. I thought about how long I had been doing that, how long I had been adjusting, accommodating, stepping back, telling myself that keeping the peace was the same as maintaining my dignity. It was not the same thing. It had never been the same thing. Dear friends, if you are watching this channel for the first time, I want to invite you to subscribe and ring that bell, because every week we bring you stories about real families, real struggles, and real courage. If this story is speaking to something in your own life, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. You are never alone in what you're carrying. Now let's get back to Maplewood Drive. That evening I was steady. I made dinner. I set the table. I listened to Madison talk about a property she'd read about in a magazine, and I passed the green beans, and I said almost nothing. Ethan watched me across the table with the careful attention of a man who isn't sure whether a storm has passed or is simply gathering. After dinner, while Madison was upstairs, Ethan found me in the kitchen. "Mom." He stopped in the doorway. "About last night, the papers." "Sit down, Ethan," I said. He sat. And I put the papers on the table between us, the same papers Madison had slid toward me the night before, and I opened them to page 3, and I pointed to the 4 words I had underlined. "Transfer of ownership interest," I said. "That is not refinancing language. You know that. He was quiet for a long moment. And then, and this is the thing I will never entirely forgive, not because it was the worst thing that happened, but because it was the most honest, he said, "I know." Just that. I know. 2 words that meant he had always known. That he had sat at that table the night before and watched his wife hand his mother a document designed to take her house, and he had said nothing. "Why?" I asked. "Madison said you'd just refuse," he said, "that if we explained it, you'd never agree. She said if you signed without fully understanding, it was better for everyone." "Better for everyone," I repeated. "Or better for you two?" He didn't answer. Madison came downstairs. She took in the papers on the table and my face and Ethan's face, and something shifted in her expression. The smoothness hardened into something more deliberate. She sat down across from me and she said, very calmly, "Barbara, this is a practical decision. The house is going to pass to Ethan eventually regardless. We're simply trying to plan responsibly." "This house," I said, "is mine. I own it outright. I have the deed to prove it, and I will not be signing anything that transfers that ownership to anyone." The calm cracked. Not dramatically, Madison was too controlled for drama, but the mask shifted, and underneath it I saw something cold and calculating that I recognized. I had seen it before, in people who have decided that what they want matters more than what is true. "You're being unreasonable," she said. "You're 62 years old. This house is too much for one person. Have you even thought about your future? There are lovely retirement communities." "Madison," my voice did not shake, "I am a licensed nurse. I own my home free and clear. I am in perfect health, and I will not be discussed like a problem to be managed at my own kitchen table." She stood up. "Then maybe it's time to think about what kind of arrangement actually makes sense here. For everyone." What she meant was plain: leave or sign. Those were the choices being offered to me in my own home. I looked at my son, who was staring at the table. I looked at Madison, who was staring at me. I picked up the papers. I stood up, and I said, "I'll need some time to think." It was not a surrender. It was a delay. There is a difference, and I knew exactly which one it was, even if they did not. Looking back, I think Madison had already decided how that night was going to end before I ever sat down at the dinner table. That's the thing about people who plan: they don't leave much room for outcomes they haven't accounted for. What she hadn't accounted for was that I had done some planning of my own. But plans and reality have a way of colliding, and that collision, when it came, was uglier than anything I had prepared myself for. The hours between dinner and 10 o'clock that evening had a particular quality: the tight, airless feeling of a house where something is about to happen and everyone knows it and nobody will say so. Madison moved through the rooms with a clipped efficiency that I recognize now as purposeful. She was not tidying. She was not relaxing. She was waiting. Ethan stayed close to her orbit, doing the thing he had perfected over however many months. This plan had been in motion, present but unaccountable, nearby but uninvolved, as though physical proximity could somehow exempt him from responsibility. I stayed in my room for most of the evening. I sat at my desk and I wrote things down: dates, incidents, exact words I could remember, the sofa, the photographs, the kitchen reorganization, the lock on the outside of my door. Every conversation, as close to verbatim as memory allowed. I filled 4 pages in my small notebook, and when I was done, I put the notebook in the same coat pocket as the manila envelope from Rachel's office. I was not going to be a woman with feelings and no evidence. I was going to be a woman with feelings and a documented record. At 9:40, there was a knock at my bedroom door. Not a soft knock, the kind that announces itself. I opened it. Madison stood in the hallway, and behind her, a step back, was Ethan. "We need to finish the conversation from earlier," Madison said. "All right," I said. "Come in." She shook her head. "The kitchen. Please." That please was the most threatening word she had said to me yet. It was the please of a person who has already made a decision and is extending you the courtesy of informing you of it. We went to the kitchen. I sat at the table. Madison remained standing a choice, I noted. Not an accident. Ethan stood near the counter with his arms crossed, looking at a spot somewhere above my head. Madison began. She was very organized. She talked about the practicalities of the living situation. She talked about the strain of 3 adults in one house. She talked about how it wasn't healthy for any of them, and particularly for me, she said, with a concern so manufactured it was almost impressive to continue an arrangement that wasn't working. She mentioned, twice, that there were very comfortable, independent living communities with excellent amenities and medical support that would be ideal for a woman in my position. A woman in my position? I let her finish. Then I said, Madison, I own this house. My name is on the deed. I have a copy of that deed in my possession, and I reviewed it this morning with my attorney. You are living here because I allowed it. That is the entirety of the arrangement. The room went very still. Your attorney, Madison repeated. Rachel Mewen, real estate law. She reviewed the documents you presented to me last night and confirmed what I suspected, that they are a quitclaim deed, not refinancing paperwork, and that signing them would transfer full ownership of this property to you and Ethan. I will not be signing them. Ethan's arms uncrossed. His hands dropped to his sides. Madison looked at him. Just a flicker of a glance, fast as a blink. Then she looked back at me, and the temperature in her expression dropped by about 20 degrees. You went behind our backs. I went to a lawyer, I said, in my own car, on a public street, to get information about a document that directly affects my legal rights. I don't require your permission for that. What happened next moved quickly, the way these things always do once the pretense falls away and there's nothing left but the ugliness underneath. Madison said the arrangement wasn't working. Ethan said he thought it might be best if I considered other options. Madison said she'd done some research, and there was a very well-reviewed facility about 20 minutes away that specialized in independent senior living. Senior living. As though I were a problem that had become inconvenient. I'm 62 years old, I said. I work full-time as a registered nurse. I pay the taxes on this house. I will not be relocated to a facility. Mom. Ethan's voice had a plea in it, but it was the wrong kind of plea, not the plea of a son who is sorry, but the plea of a man who wants his mother to stop making something difficult. Just think about what makes sense for everyone. What makes sense, I said, is that the two of you find your own housing. I opened my home to you when you needed help. What you have done in return is attempt to take that home from me through a document you described as a formality. That is what has happened here, Ethan. Say it clearly. He didn't say it clearly. He looked at Madison. And Madison and I will carry this moment for the rest of my life. Madison turned to Ethan with the quiet authority of a woman who has already decided, and she said, She's not going to be reasonable. We discussed what to do if this happened. Ethan went upstairs. I sat at my kitchen table and listened to him move around overhead. I heard the scrape of something heavy on the floor. I heard the particular hollow sound of a small suitcase being dragged. And I thought with a grief that I cannot fully describe to you even now he packed this already. He did this in advance. Ethan came downstairs carrying my small overnight bag, the navy blue one I used for work trips, and set it by the front door. He did not look at me while he did it. Madison stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded, watching. I stood up from the table. Ethan James Collins, I said, and I used all three names the way I had when he was small and had done something I needed him to understand was serious. Look at me. He looked at me. And in his face I saw something I hadn't expected, not cruelty, not malice, but something almost worse. Shame. He was ashamed, and he was doing it anyway, and that combination, in my own son's face, in my own kitchen, at nearly 10 o'clock at night, was the sharpest thing I have ever felt. You're putting me out of my own house, I said. It's temporary, he said, just until things settle down. Just Madison's voice from the doorway, impatient. Ethan. He picked up my bag. He walked to the front door. He opened it. He set the bag on the porch. And then he said, and I want you to hear this, I want you to understand what my son said to me on the porch of the house his father built, he said, in a voice that was flat and cold and not entirely his own. You're just a useless mouth to feed. The door closed, not slammed, which would have been almost easier. It closed with a soft, definitive click, the way you close a door when you want to make clear that what's on the other side no longer concerns you. I stood on the porch in the November night. The motion sensor light had come on when Ethan opened the door, and it lit the front walk in a pale, cold glow. Frank's rose bushes were dark shapes along the fence line, bare for the winter, stubborn and rooted and still there. I looked at the door. I thought about knocking. Not from desperation. I want to be clear about that. I thought about it because I was trying to decide whether any version of that conversation, on that night, with those two people in that state, would produce anything other than more damage. And I decided that it would not. I was not going to beg entrance to my own house from a woman who had tried to steal it. I was not going to say another word to my son that night, because the words I wanted to say deserved to be said when there were witnesses and documentation and nowhere for the truth to hide. I picked up my navy blue bag. I walked down the porch steps and across the dark lawn to the house next door, where a light was still on in the kitchen window because Denise Pruitt kept late hours and had, for 20 years, been the kind of neighbor who left a light on. I knocked on her door. She opened it, took one look at me standing there with my overnight bag in the November cold, and said, without surprise, without drama, in the voice of a woman who has been paying attention for a long time, "Come inside, Barbara Jean. I'll put the kettle on." There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. I had experienced it before, after long trauma shifts, after Frank's funeral, after the particular brutality of those first months of widowhood when you wake up every morning and have to remember all over again. It is an exhaustion that lives in the chest rather than the body, a heaviness that tea and rest cannot touch, though both are offered and both are accepted because the person offering them loves you, and you do not want to refuse love when it is standing in front of you with a kettle. Denise's kitchen was warm. It smelled like the cinnamon candle she kept on the windowsill and the faint residue of whatever she'd made for dinner. She set a mug in front of me and sat down across the table and folded her hands and said, "Start from the beginning." So I did. I told her everything. Not the abbreviated version, not the version where I summarized and softened and left out the parts that reflected badly on my son, the full version, in order, from the day I had invited Ethan back, to the day Madison handed me the papers across the kitchen table, to the moment I had sat in Rachel Mewen's office and heard the word quitclaim spoken out loud by someone with a law degree. I told her about the lock on the outside of my bedroom door. I told her about the photographs in the basement. I told her about Frank's sofa sitting down there in the dark. Denise did not interrupt. Denise did not make sounds of sympathy or outrage. She sat with her hands folded and her face going progressively stiller and harder, the way still water freezes gradually, and then completely. I had known this woman for 20 years. I had seen her handle the death of her husband, a daughter's divorce, a grandson's illness. She was not a woman who performed emotion. When Denise Pruitt went still and hard, it meant she was thinking, and what she was thinking was serious. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Rachel Mewen," she said finally. "She gave you a copy of the deed, in a manila envelope. It's in my coat." Denise nodded slowly. "And the notebook, the dates and incidents." "Same pocket." Another nod. Then she looked at me with those steady brown eyes and said something that I needed to hear more than I had realized. "You did everything right, Barbara. You didn't panic, you didn't sign, you got the right information from the right person, and you documented it. You did everything exactly right." I felt something release in my chest just slightly, just enough to let in a little air. "Now," Denise said, "finish your tea and get some sleep. The back bedroom is made up. We'll figure out the next step in the morning." I wanted to argue that I was fine, that I didn't need to impose, that I could manage. Instead, I picked up my mug and drank my tea. Because I was 62 years old and I had been put out of my own house by my own son, and the woman I loved like a sister had just told me I had done everything right, and sometimes that is enough to undo a person, in the best possible way. I was asleep within 20 minutes of my head touching the pillow. What happened after I fell asleep, Denise told me the next morning. She had sat at her kitchen table for a while after I went to bed. She didn't say how long, just a while thinking. Then she had gotten up, gone to the small ceramic bowl on her kitchen counter where she kept important things, and found the number she had stored there 2 years ago. Daniel's number. She had gotten it from me years back. During one of those practical conversations neighbors have, just in case something happens and you can't reach me directly, here's who to call. She had used it twice before, both times to gently nudge Daniel to come home when she thought I seemed lonelier than I was letting on. He had always responded, and he had always come. She told me later that she had never had to say much, just enough to let him know his mother needed him, and Daniel, being Daniel, would take care of the rest. That night she sent him 3 sentences. She told me later she had written and deleted several longer versions, then decided that Daniel was not a man who needed a lot of words to understand what mattered. What she sent was, "Daniel, your mama needs you. Something serious happened tonight. Come home." She set the phone down and went to bed. He arrived at 1:53 in the morning. Denise heard the car first. She was a light sleeper, and by the time Daniel knocked, she was already at the door. He was still in the clothes he'd been wearing in his university office. From the look of it, dark jeans, a gray pullover, his winter jacket not quite zipped. His hair was the way it got when he'd been running his hands through it while he drove and thought. He had driven 3 hours through the night without stopping, which I know because Denise checked the timestamp on her text and the time he knocked and did the math. "Where is she?" he said. "Asleep in the back room." "She's all right." Denise stepped aside to let him in. "But she needs you to hear the whole story before you do anything." "I'm not going to do anything tonight," he said. "I just needed to be here." Denise told me later that those words, "I just needed to be here," were when she decided for certain that Daniel Collins was going to be exactly what this situation required. I don't know what woke me. I came out of sleep the way I had in that hallway 3 nights ago, suddenly, fully, without transition. The room was dark, the house was quiet, and then I heard, from the kitchen, the low sound of Denise's voice, and underneath it, a voice I had not heard in person since Labor Day. I got up. I walked down the hall in my borrowed socks on Denise's hardwood floors, and I pushed open the kitchen door, and Daniel was sitting at Denise's kitchen table. He looked up when I walked in. He stood up. He didn't say anything, no greeting, no explanation, no recitation of how long he had driven or what Denise had told him. He just pulled out the chair next to his and waited for me to come sit in it. I sat down. And he put his hand over mine on the table, just that, just the warm weight of his hand, and I looked at my younger son's face, and I saw his father in it the way I sometimes did, around the eyes and the jaw, and I felt the full weight of the last several days arrive in my chest all at once, and I cried. Not the controlled, private crying I had done alone in my room. The other kind, the kind that has been waiting and will not wait anymore. Daniel kept his hand on mine and didn't say a word, and Denise quietly put the kettle back on, and I cried until I was done. We sat at that kitchen table until nearly 4 in the morning. Denise told the story, first the part she knew from observation, the gradual changes she had watched from next door, the things I had mentioned in passing over the previous months that now assembled themselves into a clear and damning picture. I filled in the parts she didn't know, the overheard conversation, the midnight document, Rachel's office, the quitclaim deed, the exact words Ethan had said on the porch. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting once. I watched his face as the story built. It didn't show anger, exactly. It showed something more controlled than anger. A kind of careful attention that reminded me of the way he used to take apart a broken appliance as a boy, laying each piece out in order, understanding the whole system before he attempted a repair. When we had finished, when everything was laid out on that kitchen table as plainly as the deed in its manila envelope, he was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and said softly, "I understand now." 4 words. But the way he said them, steady, complete, without dramatics, told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't saying "I understand and I am angry." He wasn't saying "I understand and isn't that terrible." He was saying "I understand the full picture. I know what needs to happen next, and I am here." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You drove 3 hours," I said. 2 hours 50, he said. "There's no traffic at midnight." Denise laughed, just a little, and it was such an ordinary human sound in the middle of all that weight that I laughed too, just briefly, just enough. "Get some sleep," Daniel said. "We'll go over in the morning." "She'll call the police," I said. "Madison will say I have no right." "You have every right," he said. "You have the deed. You have the attorney. And you have me." He said it simply, without performance. "Go to bed, Mom." I went to bed. For the first time since the night I had stood in the dark hallway and heard my son's voice saying, "We're just moving the timeline," for the first time since any of this had begun, if I am honest, I felt something that resembled safety. Not because Daniel was going to fight my battle for me, but because I was no longer standing alone in it. And there is a difference between those two things that only a person who has stood alone in something difficult can fully understand. Outside Denise's spare bedroom window, the November sky was beginning to shift from black to the deep blue that comes just before dawn. Somewhere on the other side of the fence, on Maplewood Drive, Frank's rose bushes stood bare and rooted in the cold ground, waiting for spring the way they always had. Patient, stubborn, still there. I have walked through the front door of that house on Maplewood Drive more times than I could count. I walked through it the first day we owned it, when Frank carried me over the threshold as a joke because we'd already been married 12 years, and I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my keys. I walked through it after every night shift at Riverside, tired, smelling like antiseptic, grateful for the particular silence of a house where everyone is still sleeping. I walked through it after Frank's funeral, when the world had been rearranged into something I didn't yet know how to live in. That November morning, I walked toward it from across the lawn with my son on one side and my neighbor on the other, and the manila envelope under my arm, and I want to tell you that I felt powerful and righteous and unafraid. The truth is more complicated than that. The truth is that I felt all of those things, and also, underneath them, the particular grief of a woman walking toward a confrontation with her own child, because whatever happened at that door, whatever was said in that kitchen, Ethan was still my son. That fact did not change, it just hurt differently now. Daniel had spoken to Rachel Mewen before we left Denise's house, a brief call, early, while I was drinking coffee, and Denise was pressing a good breakfast on both of us, with the focused generosity of a woman who shows love through feeding people. Rachel confirmed the deed, confirmed my standing, and told Daniel what she had told me, that I held every card in this hand, legally speaking, and that the only question was how I chose to play them. Daniel thanked her, hung up, and ate his eggs without comment. He had barely said 20 words all morning. I had learned, raising that boy, that Daniel's silence was never empty. It was always full of something being processed, organized, prepared. I did not try to fill it. Madison opened the door. She had clearly not expected 3 of us. She had, I suspect, expected me perhaps with Denise, who she had always dismissed as a harmless elderly neighbor with opinions above her station. She had not expected Daniel, standing one step behind me and to the left, in his gray pullover with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face absolutely, completely still. I watched her take him in. I watched the small recalibration happen behind her eyes, the assessment, the adjustment, the split second where her prepared position shifted to accommodate an unexpected variable. Madison was quick. I had always granted her that. But quick is not the same as ready, and she was not ready for Daniel. "Barbara," she said, keeping her voice smooth, "I didn't know you were bringing." "May we come in?" I said. It was not a question. Ethan was in the living room. He stood up when we came in, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, something close to relief that I had come back, and then, when he registered Daniel behind me, something that looked very much like a man who has just understood that the reckoning he had been half expecting has arrived in a form he didn't anticipate. The brothers looked at each other across the living room. They did not speak. There was a long moment of something passing between them, not warmth, not hostility, just the complicated recognition of 2 people who share a history and are standing on opposite sides of something for the first time. I sat down in the armchair by the window, Frank's chair, the one Madison had not managed to relocate. Denise sat on the gray sectional that had replaced my caramel sofa. Daniel remained standing, near the door, which I understood was intentional. He was not positioning himself as an aggressor. He was positioning himself as a witness who was not going anywhere. I reached into the manila envelope and laid the copy of the deed on the coffee table. "I want to show you both something," I said. Madison crossed her arms. Ethan came closer, looked down at the document. "This is the recorded deed for this property," I said. "Certified copy, pulled from county records yesterday morning by my attorney Rachel Mewen." I let that name land. You'll notice there is one name on it. Ethan picked it up. I watched his face as he read. The color changed, not dramatically, but genuinely, the way color drains from a face when the body understands something before the mind has finished processing it. Madison reached over and took the document from him. She turned it over. She looked at the front again. She was looking, I knew, for her own name, for Ethan's name, for any language that gave them standing. There was none. There was only Barbara Jean Collins, printed in the plain, unambiguous type of an official county record, followed by an address that had been mine for 33 years. She set it down. She said, very carefully, "This doesn't change the conversation about responsible financial planning." Madison. Daniel's voice, from near the door. It was the first word he had spoken since we walked in, and the quiet weight of it turned everyone in the room toward him. He looked at his sister-in-law without anger, and that, I think, was what unsettled her most. Anger she could have worked with. What Daniel offered instead was something harder to deflect clarity, delivered without heat, by a person who had no axe to grind and no personal wound to dress. "My brother lost his job," he said, "and my mother opened this house to him without a moment's hesitation. She gave up her space, her routine, her privacy. She welcomed you both." He paused. "What the two of you did in return was wait until midnight and put a quitclaim deed in front of her and call it refinancing paperwork. You can call it financial planning if it makes it easier to say. I call it taking advantage of the woman who saved you." Madison opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," Daniel said, not loudly, just firmly. He turned to Ethan. And what happened next was the thing I have thought about most in all the months since, because it was not what I expected from my quiet, measured younger son, and it was exactly what was needed. He did not lecture Ethan. He did not accuse him. He reached back into the shared history that only two brothers from the same family possess, and he laid it out like evidence. "Dad built this house with his hands, Ethan," he said. "You know that. He planted those rose bushes out back when you were in 8th grade. Do you remember that summer? He had you helping him dig the beds. You complained the whole time because you wanted to be at Kevin Marsh's house. The smallest pause. He painted that back fence the summer I was 10. He let me help even though I was making more of a mess than a job of it. He was patient about it." Ethan was very still. "That man spent 30 years making sure nobody could take this from his family," Daniel said. "And you were going to put your name on it." The room was silent. I watched my older son's face. I had seen Ethan look embarrassed before caught in a lie as a teenager, dressed down by a supervisor, wrong about something in public. This was different. This was not the face of a man who was embarrassed. This was the face of a man who was ashamed, genuinely, deeply ashamed, and who had nowhere to put it because it was true, and he knew it was true, and the person saying it was his younger brother, who had never once in their lives stood on the opposite side of anything from him. That, I think, was what broke through. Not my words, not Rachel's document, not the legal reality of the deed on the coffee table. The memory of their father, offered quietly by the one person in the room whose motives Ethan could not question. Ethan looked at the floor. Madison said something about good intentions, about financial security, about what was practical. I let her finish. Then I said what I had come to say, in the voice I used when I needed to be heard completely and without ambiguity, the voice I had used at bedsides and in hallways and in every difficult conversation of a long professional life. I will not sign any document transferring ownership of this property. I will not be moving to any facility. This house is mine. It has always been mine, and it will remain mine. I looked at both of them. I am asking you to begin making arrangements to find other housing. I will give you a reasonable amount of time to do that. If the situation does not resolve itself, my next conversation will be with Rachel Mewen about formal proceedings. Madison's jaw tightened. Ethan said nothing. "I think we're done for this morning," I said. I picked up the deed from the coffee table and put it back in the envelope. I stood up from Frank's chair. "I'll be back in my room. I'd appreciate if my things were left where they belong." I walked down the hall. Denise followed me. Daniel stayed in the living room, not confrontationally, just present, the way he had been all morning. A witness, a ballast. I sat on the edge of my bed and I pressed my hands flat on my knees and I breathed, slow and steady. From the living room, I heard nothing for a long moment, then the sound of a chair being pushed back, then Madison's footsteps on the stairs. Then, eventually, the low sound of Ethan's voice and Daniel's voice, just the two of them, too quiet to make out words. I did not strain to hear. Whatever passed between my sons in that room was between them, and it needed to be. I sat on my bed in my own house, in my own room, and I looked at the bare spot on the wall where a photograph of Frank in his mechanic's uniform had hung for 20 years, and I thought I am going to put that back up today. And I did. Chapter 8. What the house was always worth. Moving day was quiet. I had expected some version of drama. Madison had seemed, in every interaction we'd had, like a woman who would not exit a situation without making the exit mean something. But the morning Ethan and Madison left Maplewood Drive, there was no scene. Just the flat, tired sound of cardboard boxes being taped and carried, and the particular hollow echo a house makes when furniture is being moved through it toward a door. Daniel had gone back to Ann Arbor 3 days after the confrontation. Before he left, he stood in the backyard for a long while by himself, next to Frank's rose bushes, bare and dormant in the late November cold, but rooted deep, the way Frank had always planted things, with the long view in mind. I watched him from the kitchen window. He didn't know I was watching, or maybe he did and didn't mind. He just stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at those bushes the way you look at something that connects you to a person who is gone. I didn't go out. Some moments don't need company. Some moments are between a son and his father, even when the father has been 8 years in the ground, and I understood that well enough to leave it alone. When Daniel came back inside, he said, "I'll come back for Christmas, Mom. A real visit." "I'll make the spare room up properly," I said. He hugged me at the door, a long one, the kind you give when you mean it, and then he drove back up to Ann Arbor and his dissertation and his life, and I stood on the porch and watched his taillights until they were gone. Ethan and Madison found an apartment on the east side of Columbus, a 2-bedroom in a complex near the highway, which Ethan mentioned with the careful neutrality of a man trying to make something ordinary sound acceptable. They had signed the lease within 2 weeks of the confrontation. I don't know whether that speed reflected efficiency or a desire to be done with Maplewood Drive as quickly as possible. I didn't ask. Moving day itself fell on a gray Saturday in early December. I stayed mostly in the kitchen, out of the way. I was not going to stand over them and watch, which would have felt punishing, and I was not going to make myself scarce in my own house, which would have felt like an apology I didn't owe. So I made coffee, and I sat at my kitchen table with a book I wasn't really reading, and I listened to the sounds of departure, the tape gun, the footsteps on the stairs, the low voices exchanging practical information about what went in which box. Madison moved efficiently, the way she did everything, without waste. At one point she came through the kitchen to get a glass of water, and we were in the same room for approximately 45 seconds. She did not speak. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say between us that would have made anything better, and we both understood that. She did not say goodbye when they finished. She went out to the car, and she did not look back at the house. I watched from the kitchen window, and I felt not triumph, not satisfaction exactly, but something quieter and more durable. The feeling of a thing being resolved, of a situation being returned to what it actually was, stripped of the false version that had been constructed around it. Madison's absence from my life, in the weeks and months that followed, was not a loss. I want to be honest about that. She had never been a daughter-in-law to me in any real sense. She had been a strategy, wearing a pleasant face, and the strategy had failed. And with its failure, she had nothing left to offer the relationship, and apparently no interest in building something new. Her silence was, in its own way, a clean thing. Cleaner than a hollow apology would have been. Ethan was another matter entirely. He stopped in the kitchen on his way out the last trip, after the boxes were loaded, after Madison was already waiting in the car. He stood in the doorway the way he used to stand in doorways as a boy, when he wanted to ask something but hadn't worked out how to start. He looked around the kitchen, the clock above the stove, the window over the sink, the hook where I hung my keys, and he said, quietly, "It still looks the same in here." "Most of it," I said. He knew what I meant. He nodded. He left without saying anything else, and the front door closed behind him with the same soft click it had made the night he had shut me out, and I sat with that symmetry for a moment before I got up and washed my coffee cup and put it away. He called for the first time about 10 days later. I let it ring through to voicemail. I sat with the phone in my hand after listening to his message, his voice careful and tentative, saying he just wanted to check in, saying he hoped I was doing all right, saying he was sorry, The word landing with the uncertain weight of a man who knows the word is insufficient but has not yet figured out what sufficient would look like. I called him back that evening. "I need more time, Ethan," I said. "I'm not ready for this conversation yet." "I understand," he said. "I don't think you do, fully," I said. "But you will." I said goodnight and I hung up. And I sat for a while in Frank's chair by the window. My caramel sofa was back from the basement by then, and the family photographs were back on the hall wall, every one of them, including Frank in his mechanic's uniform, and I thought about forgiveness, about what it actually is versus what people want it to be. People want forgiveness to be a door that opens all at once, that puts everything back the way it was. Real forgiveness isn't like that. Real forgiveness is a slow process of deciding, day by day, whether you are willing to build something new with a person in place of what was broken. It cannot be rushed. It should not be rushed. And it cannot be offered before it is genuinely felt, because a forgiveness that isn't felt is just a performance, and I had no interest in performing. Ethan called again the following week, and the week after. I answered each time, and each time I let the conversation go a little longer. And gradually, slowly, honestly, something began to shift. He told me about the apartment, about the rent, which surprised him, about the utilities, about the Saturday he had to call 3 different plumbers to fix a leak under the bathroom sink and pay $240 for what Frank could have handled in 20 minutes with tools from the garage. He told me these things without complaint, just as information, the information of a man learning, at 39 years old, through the most expensive classroom available, what it cost to maintain a life. I listened. I did not say I told you so, because that was not what he needed, and it was not what I needed either. What I needed was to watch my son begin to understand something real, and what he needed was a mother who was still there to receive that understanding when it arrived. He came alone on a Tuesday in February. I saw his truck in the driveway from the kitchen window, and I dried my hands on the dish towel and waited. He knocked, which he had never done before, this being his childhood home, and the fact that he knocked told me more about where he was than anything he could have said. I opened the door, and he looked different, not older, exactly, but settled differently in himself, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with weight. We sat at the kitchen table. We had coffee. For a while, we talked about small things, Daniel's dissertation timeline, a repair I'd had done on the furnace, the Christmas visit that had been warm and easy and full of the particular comfort of 2 people who understand each other without requiring much explanation. Then Ethan set down his mug and looked at the table and said, "I was wrong, Mom. I let money trouble and pressure change how I saw things. I let someone else's plan become my plan without asking myself whether it was right. And I hurt you, in your own house. I'm sorry." I did not rush to answer. I let the words exist in the room for a moment because they deserved that. "I know you are," I said finally, "and I believe you." He looked up. "That's not the same as everything being repaired," I said, "but it's the beginning of it." He nodded. He looked around the kitchen again, the clock, the window, the photographs visible in the hallway, and he said something I have thought about many times since. "I used to think the house was the most valuable thing you had. I thought that's what this was all about, property. I understand now that the house was never the point. The life you built inside it was the point, and I almost helped take that from you." Those words came from a real place. I could hear it. They were not polished or perfect, but they were true, and true is worth more than polished every time. Denise came over the following Sunday with a coffee cake and her good coat on, which meant she was in the mood for a proper visit. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and looked around at the room, the sofa visible through the doorway, the photographs on the hall wall, the rose bushes outside the window, just beginning to show the first faint signs of new growth in the February thaw, and she smiled. "The place looks like itself again," she said. "It does," I agreed. I poured the coffee. She looked at me over her mug. "Yours again?" she said. I thought about that for a moment. "It was always mine, Denise. It just took a while for everyone to catch up to that fact." She laughed. And I laughed. And we sat in my kitchen on a Sunday morning and drank our coffee and talked about nothing important for a good long while, which is one of the finest things available to a person if you have the sense to appreciate it. Dear friends, Here is what I want to leave with you today, before we say goodbye. A home is not its walls. A home is the dignity of the person who built it, the years of work and sacrifice and love that filled it up and made it mean something. When someone tries to take that from you, they are not after the property. They are after your sense of yourself, your confidence in your own worth. Do not let them have it. Kindness is not weakness. An open door is not an invitation to take everything inside. And the moment someone tells you by word or action that your comfort and your rights are less important than their convenience, you are permitted to hold your ground. You are permitted to say no. You are permitted to go see a lawyer, document what you know, and stand in your own doorway without apology. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the person who stands beside you in that doorway is someone you didn't expect. Someone quiet. Someone who drives 3 hours in the middle of the night because a neighbor sent 3 sentences to his phone. Pay attention to those people. They are the ones worth keeping. If this story reached something in you today, please subscribe to this channel, share this video with someone you love, and leave a comment below. Your words mean more than you know. We'll be back soon with another story from the Voices of Tears family, and I think you'll want to hear it. Thank you for sitting with me today, dear friends. Take good care of yourself. And remember, the most valuable thing you own has never been a piece of property. It has always been you.